The distress beacon was already dying when Kale Ose picked it up. It flickered weak and broken through his console, a heartbeat that kept skipping. He almost missed it under the static. Almost. "That's not our sector," said the voice in his ear. "Command. Flat and bored. Let the Sevic handle their own wreck." Kyle didn't answer. He was already changing course. The ship on his scope was a mining hauler, Sevic built, the kind of ugly boxy vessel that hauled ore between asteroid fields and never saw a shot fired in anger. It shouldn't have needed rescuing. It shouldn't have been dark. He brought his shuttle alongside it slow, running his lights over the hull. No damage, no scorch marks, no hull breach, nothing torn open by weapons or rocks. Just a dead ship, drifting, its running lights off like someone had switched them out on purpose. "Command, I'm seeing an intact hull. No visible cause for the beacon." "Then log it and move on, Ose." He didn't move on. He never did. That was the thing about Kale. His supervisors called it recklessness, and maybe they weren't wrong, but he'd never once regretted opening a door that someone told him to leave shut. Except the one time it mattered most, and that time still sat in his chest like a stone he carried everywhere. He suited up and crossed the gap between ships alone. Inside, the mining hauler was cold and silent in a way that made his skin prickle. Emergency lighting cast everything in dim red. He found the first body in the cargo bay, a Sevic crewman, slumped against a support strut, face frozen in an expression Kyle had never seen on an alien before and hoped never to see again. Not pain, not surprise, terror, pure, distilled terror, and nothing else. He checked the body's suit readout out of habit. No breach, no decompression, no wound. The Sevic's heart had simply stopped, like something had reached in and turned it off. "Command, I've got a casualty. No visible cause of death, requesting—" Static ate the rest of his sentence. He tried again and got nothing but a thin whine of feedback. He moved deeper into the ship. 2 more bodies in the corridor, same expression, same nothing wrong with them except that they were dead. Kale's pulse climbed. Every instinct told him to turn around, get back to his shuttle, log it as unexplained, and let people with better equipment figure it out. He kept walking. There was a maintenance locker near the engine room, sealed from the inside. He almost passed it, one more dead end in a ship full of dead ends. But something scratched against the metal from within, soft, deliberate, not the ship settling. "Hey," he said, low into the comm mic built into his suit, translation software kicking in a half-second behind his words. "If someone's in there, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm human. I picked up your beacon." Silence. Then the scratching again, faster. He pried the locker open by hand. The alien inside flinched back so hard she hit the wall. Small, for a Sevic, with pale gray skin and wide black eyes that were doing the math on him in half a second, deciding if he was one more thing to be afraid of. She was young, younger than he'd expected. Her whole body shook. "Easy," Kale said, holding both hands up, empty. "Easy. I'm not with whatever did this. You shouldn't be here." Her voice came out cracked, barely holding together, the translator smoothing her language into something close enough to understand. "You need to leave. Now. Before it comes back." "Before what comes back?" She didn't answer. She just grabbed his arm with both hands, claws digging in through the suit fabric, and said it again. "Leave. Please. Now." He got her out of the ship in under 4 minutes, moving faster than protocol allowed. Faster than was smart with a frightened stranger who might bolt or panic in 0G. She didn't bolt. She clung to him the entire way back to his shuttle like he was the only solid thing left in the universe. As the shuttle disengaged from the mining hauler, Kale glanced at his rear sensor feed out of old habit. A last look at the wreck, the way you check a stove is off before leaving the house. For half a second, something moved against the stars behind the hauler. Not a ship. Not debris. A shape, dark even against the black of space. There and then gone before his sensors could log more than a shadow of a return. He blinked. The feed showed nothing now, just the wreck, dark and still, shrinking behind them. "You saw it," the girl said quietly. She hadn't looked at the screen. She hadn't needed to. I don't know what I saw. You don't want to know. She pulled her knees up to her chest in the passenger seat, wrapping her arms around them, making herself as small as the space would allow. Nobody wants to know. That's how it survives. Cale didn't push. He'd learned that much in his years doing this job. People who'd just watched their whole crew die didn't need questions. They needed quiet and time, and someone who wasn't going to demand answers before they were ready to give them. He got her to the aid station 3 hours later. The station doctors, her own species, Sevic medical staff assigned to the outpost, tried to take her for examination. She refused. Not loudly, not with a scene, just an absolute, immovable refusal. Her whole small body going rigid the second anyone but Cale reached for her. "She trusts you," said one of the doctors, a little baffled, a little annoyed. Why would she trust a human she's known for 3 hours over her own people? Cale didn't have an answer for that. He sat with her instead, in a spare medical bay, while station staff argued in the hallway about protocol and jurisdiction, and who was responsible for a traumatized alien with no name on record. "What's your name?" he asked her gently, once they were alone. "Rena." She said it like it cost her something. Like giving him even that much information was a risk she wasn't sure she should take. "I'm Cale." "I know. Your suit said it, broadcasting it the whole time like a beacon." A small, humorless huff, almost a laugh. "You people are very loud." "Yeah," he said. "We get that a lot." She looked at him then. Really looked. The way she hadn't allowed herself to on the ship. Something in her face shifted, not trust exactly, but the beginning of it. The first crack in a wall built out of fear. "You shouldn't have brought me back," she said. "Why not?" "Because it doesn't come for the ship." Her voice dropped low and her eyes went to the door, to the dark corner of the room, to anywhere that wasn't his face. "It comes for what's near the ship, what's touched it, what it's already noticed. And it noticed you." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, alone in his quarters, Kyle pulled up the station's communication logs out of habit, scrolling through routine traffic before he tried to sleep. He found the notice buried in the noise, flagged low priority by an overworked comms officer who probably hadn't thought twice about it. The entire star system Rena's mining vessel had come from, every outpost, every relay, every ship registered in that region, had gone silent. No distress calls, no routine check-ins, no traffic of any kind, for 3 days. He sat back in his chair, the stone in his chest growing heavier, and thought about the shape he'd seen against the stars. He thought about 6 dead crew with no wounds and no reason to be dead. He thought about Rena's voice telling him it comes for what it's already noticed. He was still thinking about it when the lights in his quarters flickered. Once, brief, and perfectly in sync with every other light on the station, all at the same instant like something had reached out and touched every circuit at once, exactly the way the mining hauler's final log had recorded, in the seconds before its crew stopped screaming. Nobody else seemed to notice the lights. Kyle sat frozen in his quarters for a full minute after the flicker, waiting for alarms, for shouting in the corridor, for any sign that someone else had seen what he'd seen. Nothing came. The station hummed along exactly as it always did, indifferent and unbothered, like the entire grid hadn't just blinked in perfect unison for no reason at all. He checked the maintenance logs, no power fluctuation recorded, no system fault. As far as the station's own diagnostics were concerned, nothing had happened. He didn't sleep that night. In the morning, he brought it to Commander Ewan Voss, the station's ranking officer, a broad, gray-haired man who'd run outposts on the edge of nowhere for 20 years, and had the permanently tired look of someone who'd seen every kind of trouble twice. A light flickered, Voss said, not looking up from his console. "Station-wide, all at once. No cause logged. Power grids hiccup, Osei, especially old ones bolted onto a rock in the middle of nowhere. The mining hauler's logs recorded the exact same thing right before the crew died." That got Voss to look up. He studied Cale for a long moment, weighing him the way a man weighs someone he respects but suspects of being tired and rattled and seeing shapes in the dark. You want me to lock this station down over a light. I want you to look into it before it happens again. Voss exhaled through his nose, long and slow, but he nodded. Quietly. I'm not starting a panic over a bad breaker. He paused. And the girl stays confined to the med bay until someone smarter than both of us figures out what killed her crew. That's not up for discussion. She's not a suspect, Voss. I didn't say she was. I said I don't know what she is, and until I do, I'm not letting her wander my station. He softened, just slightly. You did a good thing pulling her out. Don't let it turn into a bad thing by getting attached to something you don't understand yet. Cale didn't answer that. He was already attached. He'd known it the moment she grabbed his arm in that locker and hadn't let go. He spent the rest of the morning going through the recovered logs from the mining hauler instead of sleeping. The ship's internal cameras had kept running long after the crew stopped, capturing empty corridors and dark cargo bays, and buried in the days before the beacon went out. He found something that made his stomach turn. The crew's behavior had changed, gradually, days before anyone died. Sleep logs showed them awake for longer and longer stretches. Conversation between crew members, once frequent and casual, dropped off almost entirely in the final 2 days, replaced by long silences and crew members standing alone in corridors, staring at nothing. They'd stopped talking to each other, like they were each carrying something they didn't want to share, or couldn't. He brought the footage to Rena that afternoon, hoping she might recognize the pattern, and immediately regretted it. She went rigid the moment the first frame loaded, her breathing sharp and shallow. Turn it off. Rena, I need to understand what happened to them. Turn it off. She grabbed his wrist hard enough to hurt and physically pulled his hand away from the console. The screen went dark. She sat there shaking for a long moment before she trusted herself to speak again. There's an old story, she said finally, on my homeworld. Not history. Older than history. The kind of thing parents tell children to make them behave, except every child grows up and realizes the adults still believe it too. They just stopped saying it out loud. Tell me. It doesn't hunt bodies. It hunts attention. She wrapped her arms around herself. The more you notice it, the more it notices you. My people learned, a long time ago, that looking too closely at the dark is how you invite something to look back. That's just a story. So was your ghost before your species learned to be afraid of the right things. Her eyes were steady on him now, unblinking, daring him to dismiss her. My crew didn't stop talking to each other because they were sick. They stopped because every one of them had started seeing something alone and none of them wanted to say it out loud, because saying it out loud meant it was real, meant you'd looked at it long enough to describe it. Kyle sat with that for a long moment. It didn't fit anything he understood about how the universe worked, but neither did 6 dead crew with no wounds, or lights flickering across an entire station with no cause. What did you see? He asked quietly. She didn't answer. Not that day. That evening, a station technician named Preset, a wiry, nervous man who'd reviewed the hauler's camera footage as part of the investigation, started acting strange. Cale heard about it secondhand, from another tech complaining in the mess hall that Preset had gone quiet and jumpy, avoiding the reflective panels in the corridor walls like they'd bite him. Cale found him at his workstation an hour later, muttering under his breath. Numbers. A sequence, repeating, counting down. 41, 40, 39. Preset. Hey. Cale crouched next to his chair. What are you counting? Preset's eyes didn't move from the blank wall in front of him. I don't know, he whispered. I don't know why I'm counting. I just have to keep counting or I'll forget how many times I looked. Looked at what? The footage. His hands were shaking. I watched it 41 times. Trying to see what killed them, I kept rewinding, because I thought I saw something in the corner near the cargo bay. And every time I rewound, I thought I'd catch it properly this time, and I never did. And I have to keep counting or I'll lose track of how close I got. Cale pulled the report on the footage review immediately. Sure enough, Preset's workstation log showed the same 3 seconds of hauler footage, replayed dozens of times over the course of the afternoon, each viewing longer than the last, like something was pulling him back in. He brought Rena the report that night against Voss's orders, sneaking her out of the med bay for 20 minutes because he needed her read on it more than he needed to follow procedure. She read it in silence, her face unreadable, and then said the thing that made the whole shape of the mystery shift under Cale's feet. It's not the footage that's dangerous. It's what happens to a mind that keeps returning to the same unanswered question. She looked up at him. He wasn't looking for what killed the crew. By the 40th time he was looking for it, and it knows the difference. Kyle didn't sleep again that night. He kept thinking about Preset's shaking hands, about the number 41, about a mind that had crossed some invisible line between curiosity and obsession without ever noticing it happen. In the morning, Preset was gone. His shift log showed him walking calmly to the airlock at the end of the maintenance corridor at 0340 hours, alone, no alarms triggered. The airlock's access log showed no door cycle, no pressure change, no record of it ever opening. He had simply stopped existing between one frame of the corridor camera and the next. Cale stood in that corridor with Voss and 2 security officers, staring at the spot where the last frame showed Preset standing, and felt the stone in his chest grow heavier than it had ever been. "Pull every camera in this corridor," Voss said. Quiet now. All his earlier certainty gone. "Everyone. I want to know exactly where that man went." They found something instead. Something worse. On the corridor's main security camera, the one that had captured Preset's final frame, the angle had shifted. Not much. A few degrees. Barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where it was supposed to be pointed. It had moved so that it was aimed directly at the spot where Preset had been standing when he vanished. And in the current live feed, the same camera was slowly, almost imperceptibly, continuing to turn toward the door of the room where Cale and Voss stood watching it. The camera stopped turning the moment Voss ripped its power cable out of the wall. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The security officers stood frozen, one of them still holding his sidearm halfway raised at a piece of dead machinery, as if a gun had ever been the right tool for whatever this was. "Find Preset," Voss said finally, his voice rough. "Search every deck, he's somewhere on this station." They didn't find him. Not that day, not the next. His quarters were untouched, his belongings exactly where he'd left them, his half-finished meal still sitting in the mess hall recycler queue where he'd logged it the night before he disappeared. A man had walked into an airlock that never opened and simply ceased to be accounted for anywhere in the station's systems. Voss authorized an armed retrieval team the following morning anyway, insisting on a physical search of the lower maintenance decks. Kyle volunteered before anyone could tell him not to. "You're not security," Voss said. "Rena's the only one who understands any of this, and I'm the only one she'll talk to. If we find something down there, I need to be able to ask her what it means without waiting for a translator relay." Voss studied him for a long moment, then nodded, tight and reluctant. "Stay behind the team. You point at things. You don't touch them." The lower maintenance deck was dim, most of its lighting reduced to emergency red per station-wide power conservation orders that had gone out after the flicker. They found Preset 40 minutes in, sitting cross-legged in a narrow service corridor, alive, breathing, utterly unresponsive to anyone's voice. He was staring at a blank section of wall and counting under his breath. Not 41 anymore. Much lower now, descending steadily like a clock running out. 12, he whispered, as Cale crouched in front of him. 11. "Preset, can you hear me?" 10. His eyes didn't move. 9. Kyle got Rena brought up from the med bay against every rule Voss had set, because there was no time left to argue about protocol. She took one look at Preset and went pale. "It's not a countdown to an attack," she said quietly, kneeling beside him without getting too close. "It's a tally. How many times he's looked at something he wasn't supposed to see. He's not counting down to danger, he's counting down to 0. The number of looks he has left before it decides he's done wondering and started truly understanding. What happens when he understands?" She didn't answer that. She didn't have to. Cale already knew from the 6 bodies on the mining hauler with no wounds and nothing wrong with them except that their hearts had simply stopped. They moved Prisette to the med bay under sedation, and Voss, furious, frightened, and unwilling to admit either, decided he'd had enough of theories and superstition passed along by a traumatized alien teenager. "I'm going to look at that footage myself," he told Cale that evening, in his office, the recovered hauler footage already loaded on his screen. Properly, with trained eyes, not some panicked kid's ghost story. "Voss, don't... I've run this station for 6 years, Osei. I am not going to let fear run it instead." He hit play. Kyle watched 3 seconds of grainy footage, an empty cargo bay, a shadow near a support strut that could have been anything, before Voss paused it unimpressed and looked up at him like he'd expected exactly this and nothing more. "See? Nothing. It's a shadow. Your girl's people have been scaring themselves with shadows for..." The lights went out. Not the flicker this time. Total darkness station-wide. And in the silence that followed, Cale heard something he would never be able to fully describe afterward. A kind of pressure in the air, a sense of the room being suddenly, terribly occupied by something that hadn't been there a second before. It lasted 4 seconds. When the lights came back, Voss was still sitting in his chair, exactly where he'd been, eyes open, facing not the screen, but the small mirror mounted on his office wall for adjusting his uniform collar. He wasn't breathing. There was no wound, no mark. His heart, according to the medbay's later report, had simply stopped all at once, the same as every crew member on the mining hauler. Cale sat with the body for a long time before he could make himself call it in. Voss had been gruff and stubborn and had made Cale follow rules he hated, but he'd also been fair, had trusted Cale's instincts enough to keep investigating even when it scared him, had been the closest thing to a steady hand Cale had found since the rescue that still haunted him, the one he'd failed years ago. The reason he never let a distress beacon go unanswered no matter what command told him. He'd failed to protect Voss, too. He hadn't seen it coming, hadn't been fast enough, hadn't understood the shape of the danger until it was standing in the room with them. Rena found him there an hour later, still sitting beside the body, and for once she didn't say anything about the danger of standing too close to death. She just sat down next to him, quiet, and let him have the silence he needed. "I keep thinking I could have stopped him," Cale said finally. "You couldn't have. He wanted to prove it wasn't real. That's the most dangerous thing you can want when it comes to this." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, guilt old and heavy, the kind that had been sitting in her long before she ever met him. "My whole crew wanted the same thing at the end. Wanted to understand it badly enough that they stopped being afraid of it, and being afraid was the only thing keeping them careful." "You almost shut down again," Kyle said, looking at her. "When Preset disappeared, you went quiet the same way you did on the ship." "I know." She met his eyes, and something in her posture changed, a decision being made, visibly, in real time. "I'm not going to do that again, whatever this costs. I watched my whole crew die because I hid instead of helping the one person who might have understood in time. I won't do that to you." It was the most she'd ever given him. Not information, not theory, but herself. The truth of what she'd been carrying since the locker. Kyle felt something in his chest loosen just slightly. Grief and gratitude tangled together in a way he didn't have words for. He found the note the next morning, buried in Voss's terminal, time-stamped 4 minutes before the lights went out. A short line, hastily typed, like a man writing down a thought before he lost his nerve to finish it. "It's not hunting us, it's hunting whatever we brought back from that wreck." Cale read it 3 times before the meaning fully landed, cold and heavy in his stomach. Not the station, not the crew, not even Preset, who'd simply looked too long at the wrong footage. Whatever this thing was, Voss had figured out in his final minutes that it had followed something specific, back from the mining hauler, something that had been sitting quietly in the station's med bay since the day Cale carried her out of that locker. He looked up from the terminal to find Rena standing in the doorway, watching him read it, her face already crumbling with an understanding she'd clearly been carrying alone for far too long. "You knew," Kyle said quietly. "This whole time. You knew it followed you here." She didn't deny it. She just nodded once, and the tears finally came. "Why didn't you tell me?" Kale's voice came out sharper than he meant it to, and he watched Rena flinch and hated himself a little for it, and still needed the answer badly enough not to take the words back, because I hoped that if I didn't say it, it would stay untrue a little longer. She sank into the chair across from him, small and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I've been running from this since before you found me. I just let myself believe that maybe this time it hadn't followed. Tell me everything, from the beginning, all of it. So she did. The mining hauler hadn't been attacked, not the way anyone assumed. Days before the crew died, one of them, a young engineer, Rena's closest friend on the ship, had found something strange in a sealed cargo container they'd picked up from an abandoned drift station on the edge of their route. Nobody knew what it was. It didn't register on any scanner as dangerous. It simply sat there, in the dark of the cargo hold. And the engineer had gotten curious. He started going down to look at it, Rena said, her voice flat now, reciting something she'd clearly replayed in her mind 1,000 times. Just to look, every day a little longer. He said it made him feel like he was almost understanding something right at the edge of his mind if he just looked a little longer, thought a little harder. And then the whole crew died. Not right away, it took days. But once one of us noticed it noticing him back, the rest of us couldn't stop looking either. At him, at the cargo hold, at each other, wondering who'd be next to change. That's the trap. It doesn't need to hunt anyone. Curiosity does its work for it. She swallowed hard. I hid in that locker because I made myself stop looking, stop wondering. I decided I would rather die not understanding than die because I understood too much. But it followed you anyway. Because by then it already had me. Her eyes were wet, but her voice held steady. Some deep reserve of courage Kale hadn't fully seen in her until now. It doesn't need you to keep looking, once it's already looked at you long enough. I was marked before you ever opened that locker, Kale. You didn't do anything wrong by saving me, but saving me meant it's here now on this station, and it isn't leaving until it's finished. Kale sat with that, the full shape of it settling into place. This wasn't a monster that hunted ships or crews at random. It was drawn to minds trying to understand it. Minds reaching toward a question they couldn't quite answer. And the more brilliant, curious, or determined those minds were, the more dangerous the attraction became. Which meant every hour Kale had spent studying the footage, cross-referencing logs, building theories with Rena at his side. Every single thing that made him good at his job, good at rescue, good at refusing to let a mystery go unsolved, had been, this entire time, feeding it exactly what it wanted. I've been doing this to us, he said slowly. All of it. The investigating. The questions. We both have. Rena didn't try to soften it. And it's worse now, because it's not just watching you notice it. It's watching us understand each other. Two minds sharing what they've learned. That's not slower. It's faster. It's why Voss died so quickly, once he stopped believing it was a shadow and started believing it was real. The station was already unraveling by the time word of Voss's death and Preset's condition spread past the small circle who knew the details. Rumors moved faster than facts always did, and the version that spread was somehow both wrong in its details and exactly right in its terror. Crew stopped meeting each other's eyes in corridors. Someone covered every reflective surface in the mess hall with cloth. A junior officer refused to run the security cameras at all, leaving entire sections of the station blind, which caused its own panic among people who'd rather see danger coming than not see it at all. Kyle called an emergency meeting with the handful of senior staff left functioning enough to attend, Rena sitting beside him, the two of them carrying the weight of an explanation nobody wanted to hear. So what do we do? Asked the station's junior logistics officer, a woman named Iris who'd inherited command by default since nobody more senior remained. Stop looking at it? Stop thinking about it? How do you run a station full of people and tell them not to think about the thing that's killing them? I don't know yet, Kale admitted. But I know that panic feeds it as badly as curiosity does. Fear and fascination aren't as different as we'd like to believe. Both are just attention. focused hard enough to be noticed. That's not a plan, Osei, that's a riddle. It's what we have. The meeting broke up with no resolution, fear settling deeper into the station's bones with every hour that passed. Cale found himself standing in the corridor afterward with Rena, exhausted, the two of them saying nothing for a long moment, before she finally spoke the thing he could see she'd been building toward since her confession. I should isolate myself. Go back into a locker, if that's what it takes. If it's tracking me, then maybe if I stop being near anyone, stop talking, stop being understood by anyone else. No, Cale, I mean it. I did this once already. I know how to disappear into a small space and wait. And it followed you anyway, remember? You just told me that. He took her by the shoulders, gently, making her look at him instead of the floor. Hiding didn't save your crew. It didn't save you. It just meant you were alone when it found you. I'm not letting you go through that again by yourself. You could die because of me. Voss died because he stopped taking this seriously. Preset almost died because he got obsessed with proving something to himself alone in a room with no one to pull him back. Nobody on this station has died from having someone else there with them. He held her gaze steady, refusing to let her look away the way she wanted to. Maybe that's the part of this we haven't figured out yet. Maybe it isn't just about how much attention a mind gives it. Maybe it's about what kind. Rena didn't answer right away. Something in her face shifted, not agreement exactly, but the beginning of a question she hadn't let herself ask before. That was the moment the corridor lights began to change, not the sudden flicker they'd both grown to dread. Something slower this time, deliberate, the lights along the length of the corridor dimming in sequence, one after another, moving steadily toward the two of them like a countdown made visible. Cale. Rena's voice had gone very quiet. I see it. It's never done this before. It's never announced itself like this. The last light directly above them died, and for one suspended second they stood together in near total darkness. The only illumination the faint red emergency strip along the floor. Cale reached for Rena's hand without thinking, and she gripped his back hard, both of them barely breathing. Then every light on the corridor went out completely, all at once, plunging them into total blackness. Not the 4 seconds that had killed Voss, but longer, deeper, the silence stretching past any safe count Cale could keep track of. And in that darkness close enough that he felt breath stir against the side of his neck, something that was not Rena and was not him spoke a single word, low and almost curious, like it was trying the shape of it out for the first time. His name. Every instinct in Cale's body told him to run. He didn't. He wasn't sure afterward if that was courage or simple paralysis. But in the moment it didn't matter which. His legs wouldn't move, his lungs wouldn't fill, and the only thing left that seemed to still work was his voice. So he used it. What do you want? The words came out rough, barely more than a whisper, but they filled the darkness like a shout. Beside him, Rena went rigid, her hand crushing his, every part of her screaming that this was the exact wrong thing to do. The last thing anyone facing this presence had ever done was speak to it directly, and every one of them had ended up dead or worse. Nothing happened. The breath he'd felt against his neck didn't come again. The pressure in the room, that terrible sense of being occupied, watched, weighed, seemed to hesitate, like something recalibrating an equation that had just refused to balance the way it expected. I asked you a question, Kyle said, steadier now, though his heart hammered hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. What do you want? The lights came back. Slowly, dimly, section by section along the corridor, restoring themselves in the same deliberate sequence they'd died in, until Cale and Rena stood blinking in ordinary emergency lighting, alone, the corridor empty in front of them. Whatever had been there was gone. Rena let out a breath that shook badly on its way out. You shouldn't be alive. I know. No, Kyle, you don't understand. No one does that. No one talks to it. Everyone who's ever encountered it either stares trying to understand or runs trying to escape. And both of those are exactly what feeds it. She stared at him like he'd just done something impossible, which, as far as she knew, he had. You did neither. They brought the surviving crew from Rena's homeworld together that night. 3 Civic engineers who'd been quarantined separately since the mining hauler's rescue, kept isolated on the assumption that they, too, might carry whatever had followed Rena home. Cale needed their accounts, needed to know if anyone ever had done what he'd just done and lived to describe it. The answer, pieced together from 3 shaking witnesses and decades of half-buried Civic folklore, was no. Not once. Every account of an encounter, going back generations, described one of exactly 2 responses. Fixation, the compulsive need to look closer, understand more, solve it. Or avoidance, the desperate flight from anything that might mean acknowledging it existed at all. Both extremes strengthen it, said the eldest of the 3 engineers, a weathered woman named Tesset who'd spent 30 years working ore routes near systems where the old stories were still taken seriously. Fixation feeds it understanding. Avoidance feeds it fear. Either way, the mind gives it something to hold on to, something to become entangled with. So what did I give it by talking to it? Cale asked. Tesset studied him for a long moment, the way someone studies a puzzle piece that doesn't match any picture they've ever seen before. I don't know. Nothing it recognized clearly, or it wouldn't have retreated. Perhaps that's the answer in itself. It didn't withdraw because you were strong. It withdrew because it didn't know what you were doing. Kyle turned that over for a long time afterward, alone in his quarters, unable to sleep, running back through everything that had happened since the moment he'd pulled Rena out of that locker. He thought about every alien reaction he'd witnessed to genuine fear or crisis over the years he'd spent doing rescue work. Species that froze completely, species that fled without hesitation, species whose entire culture was built around avoiding uncertainty at any cost. And he thought about humanity. Messy, stubborn, contradictory humanity, whose entire history was one long argument with the unknown, running toward storms to study them, walking straight into disease wards to treat the sick, standing in front of the things that terrified them and asking questions instead of only fleeing or freezing. Not because humans were braver by nature, because somewhere along the way, humanity had learned, slowly, painfully through millions of small failures, that the unknown responded differently when you met it honestly instead of either devouring it with obsession or refusing to look at it at all. He brought the theory to Rena the next morning and watched her expression shift from doubt to something closer to hope as he laid it out. "You're saying it isn't a hunter at all," she said slowly. "Not really. You're saying it's something like a mirror. It reflects back whatever intensity a mind brings to it. Fear becomes lethal fear. Obsession becomes lethal obsession. And it kills because that's simply what happens when the reflection grows too sharp to survive. I think so. I think that's why it's never encountered anything like what I did last night, because it needed a mind that could face it honestly, afraid, but not fleeing, curious, but not obsessed. Something in between that none of your people, or maybe anyone's people, had ever managed to offer it before. And if you're right, then maybe it's not something we destroy. Maybe it's something we starve. Take away the extremes it feeds on and there's nothing left for it to hold on to. It was a fragile theory, built on one strange encounter and generations of half-remembered fear. But it was the only thread either of them had to pull. Kyle volunteered to test it fully, not a hurried exchange in a dark corridor, but a deliberate, sustained confrontation, calm and honest, the way you'd speak to someone you were trying to understand, rather than something you were trying to defeat. Rena argued against it for nearly an hour before finally, reluctantly, agreeing to be there beside him. "If you're doing this, I'm not letting you do it alone. Whatever it takes from you, it takes from both of us." They chose the same corridor where it had spoken his name, reasoning that wherever it had manifested most strongly was the place most likely to answer again. Station comms, already strained from days of crisis and fear, chose that exact hour to fail completely. A total blackout of all channels, cutting them off from any backup, any support, any way to call for help if this went wrong. The last message that came through before the silence, garbled and broken and impossible, stopped Cale's heart cold. It was Voss's voice, or something wearing the shape of it. Don't let it see you the way I did. Cale stood frozen in the dead corridor, comms silent in his ear. Rena's hand tight in his, both of them staring at the darkness ahead as the lights began once more to fail in that same slow, deliberate sequence. This time, when the darkness lifted, it didn't retreat into nothing. It stayed. And for the first time since any of this began, they could finally see it. Not a shadow, not an absence, but a shifting humanoid shape standing at the far end of the corridor, its edges unstable like smoke fighting to hold a form. The form it had chosen to hold was Voss's face, and it looked directly at Cale, tilted its borrowed head with an expression that was almost curious, almost gentle, and spoke his name again. Not a question this time, but something closer to recognition. Voss. Cale said the name before he could stop himself, and instantly regretted it. Regretted the crack in his own voice, the flood of grief that came up so fast it nearly buckled his knees. Beside him, Rena's grip on his hand tightened hard enough to hurt, a silent warning. Don't let this become the thing that swallows you. The shape at the end of the corridor tilted its borrowed head again, studying him with Voss's tired, familiar eyes set into something that wasn't Voss at all. It's not him, Cale said, more to himself than to Rena, forcing the words out slow and steady even as his chest ached with the wrongness of seeing that face again. It's wearing him, that's all. The shape didn't deny it. It didn't confirm it either. It simply watched, waiting, the way it had waited in the corridor before it spoke his name, as if it too were trying to understand what it was looking at. Why him? Cale asked, and made himself keep his voice level, keep it curious instead of accusing, grieving instead of afraid. Why his face? For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the voice came, layered strangely, Voss's cadence but something else moving underneath it. Fragments of other voices bleeding through at the edges like a badly tuned signal. Last, it said. Just that, at first, like it was testing the shape of an idea it had never needed to put into words before. Last mind. Held. Strongest. You mean he's the last person you took? Cale's stomach turned, but he kept his footing, kept his eyes open, kept himself from either the terror or the fixation Rena had warned him about. You wear whoever you took most recently, whoever hit you hardest. He believed, the shape said. Then feared. Then nothing. The layered voice hesitated. Loud, louder than most. Cale understood, with a wave of grief that nearly stole his breath entirely. Voss hadn't died from curiosity, not exactly. He died because he'd gone from certainty that nothing was wrong to sudden total terror in the space of a few seconds. No gradual understanding to soften the blow, just a wall of disbelief collapsing all at once into raw fear. That collision, sharp and violent, had apparently left more of an impression than anything else it had consumed. He was a good man, Cale said, and let the grief show plainly on his face instead of swallowing it down. He was trying to protect his people. He didn't deserve what happened to him, and I'm never going to pretend that it's okay that it did. The shape flickered, its edges losing cohesion for just a moment, like something in Cale's words had disrupted whatever held it together. It wasn't a physical reaction Cale expected, no lunge, no attack, but the wrongness of the moment before. That inhuman stillness cracked slightly, showing something underneath that looked almost like confusion. You feel it, the shape said. Not a question. Something closer to bewilderment. Grief. Whole. Not hidden. Not chasing. No, Cale agreed. I'm not hiding it, and I'm not trying to solve it either. He's dead. That's just true. I don't need to understand every piece of why to know that it hurts, and I don't need to run from the hurt to survive it. Rena stepped forward then, and Kyle felt her hand slip from his, not letting go out of fear, but choosing, deliberately, to stand a half step ahead instead of hiding behind him. Her voice, when it came, shook, but she didn't stop. My crew is dead too, she said, looking directly at the shifting shape, refusing the instinct every part of her body had been trained toward for her entire life. The instinct to look away, to run, to disappear into the smallest space available, and wait for danger to pass her by. I hid instead of helping them. I told myself it was the safest thing to do, but it wasn't safety. It was fear wearing the shape of a plan. I've carried that every day since, and I'm not going to keep hiding from it, or from you. The shape's outline shuddered harder this time, Voss's features blurring at the edges like wet paint running, other faces briefly surfacing beneath his and vanishing again, a dozen half-glimpsed expressions, dozens of minds it had touched over who knew how many years, none of them staying long enough to fully form. Fear, it said, the layered voice fraying now, losing the steadiness it had held a moment before. Understood, held, not. It struggled visibly, for the first time since it had appeared. Not amplified. That's right, Kale said, stepping forward now to stand beside Rena instead of behind her. We're not obsessing over you. We're not running from you either. We're just telling you the truth, plainly, the way you tell the truth to someone you're grieving with instead of someone you're afraid of. He held its gaze steady, even as every instinct screamed at him to look away. Grief doesn't need to feed anything. It just needs to be felt honestly. That's all this is. The shape convulsed, its form collapsing inward and expanding outward in the same motion, faces and fragments surfacing and dissolving faster now, like a held breath finally released after being trapped for far too long. The lights along the corridor flared bright, then dim, then bright again, the whole station's power grid seeming to shudder with whatever was happening in front of them. And then, all at once, it simply came apart. Not an explosion, not a death. It unraveled the way smoke unravels in open air, thinning and spreading and losing all shape until there was nothing left standing in the corridor at all. Just empty space, ordinary station lighting, and the quiet hum of a ventilation system that had never actually stopped running. Kale and Rena stood there for a long time afterward, neither of them quite willing to move first, both of them waiting for it to come back. It didn't. Comms crackled back to life 20 minutes later, flooding Kale's ear with a dozen overlapping voices from Station Command asking for status, asking if anyone was hurt, asking what had happened to the lights. He answered as steadily as he could manage, though his hands didn't stop shaking for another hour. The station recovered slowly over the following days. Preset woke from his sedation disoriented but whole, with no memory of his time in the maintenance corridor, and no further compulsion to count anything at all. The crew, human and Sevic alike, began meeting each other's eyes again in the hallways, tentatively at first, then with the easy unconcern of people who'd simply forgotten for a while that looking at another face used to be safe. Tessit and the other Sevic engineers filed a full report back to their homeworld, and the story that eventually traveled through wider space, through trade routes and diplomatic channels, and the kind of quiet conversations that shaped how species thought about each other, wasn't a story about weapons or tactics or human superiority. It was a story about a rescue pilot who had stood in the dark, faced something ancient and unknowable, and simply refused to give it either his fear or his obsession, offering it honesty instead. Humanity earned something from that story that no fleet or show of force could have bought: a reputation, spreading slowly among species who'd spent generations either fixating on the unknown or fleeing from it, as beings who could be trusted to face terror without losing themselves to it. Not fearless. Never that. Just steady, in a way that turned out to matter more than fear ever could. Rena stayed on the station after the reports were filed, declining the transport home her own government offered her, choosing instead to take a position on Kyle's rescue crew, the first Sevic ever to do so, a fact that made several stiff diplomatic officials deeply uncomfortable and made Rena, for the first time since Kale had met her, genuinely happy. They sat together on the observation deck one evening, weeks later, watching the slow wheel of stars outside the viewport, the station finally quiet in a way that felt earned rather than merely restored. I keep thinking about what it said, Rena admitted. Not amplified. Like that was the strangest thing it had ever encountered. Stranger than the dying. Maybe it was. Kyle leaned back, some of the old weight finally loosening in his chest. Not gone. He suspected it never would be entirely, but lighter than it had been in a long time. The rescue he'd failed years ago still lived in him, quietly, but it no longer felt like a debt he was still trying to pay off. It felt like something he'd finally learned from instead. Maybe nobody ever showed it that you could feel something all the way through without needing to solve it or escape it. You did that. Not just for it. For me too. She looked at him, steady now. None of the old fear left in her eyes when she held his gaze. I want to stay. Here. With this crew. With you if that's something you want as well. Yeah, Cale said, and meant it more fully than he'd meant anything in years. That's something I want. The lights above them flickered, just once. Faint and quick. Gone before either of them could be entirely sure they'd seen it at all. Rena's hand found his without hesitation this time. No fear behind the motion, just habit, just comfort. They didn't look away from the stars. They didn't need to. Some things, once you'd learned how to face them honestly, simply stopped being something to fear at all.